Today's video is a deep dive on the Lisa Eldridge MUSE palette. So I'm actually going to be showing you two different looks that I did with this palette. And just like all of my other deep dive palette videos, I'm going to be doing individual swatches of each of these shades and comparisons from other shadows in my collection. Before we get into it, if you're not subscribed to my channel already and you enjoy this video, you enjoy my content, I would love for you to consider subscribing to my channel. I do tons of Lisa Eldridge content, as well as lots of content on other high-end luxury and indie makeup brands. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, I would love for you to subscribe. And now let's get into the MUSE palette. So I've actually filmed this video over 2 separate days, with actually a day in between where I didn't work with it. I decided that I wanted to re-film this video and do another look with this palette, because I did have a little bit of a challenge with the first day that I used this palette and the first time I tried recording this video. So I'll be showing you the look I did there, and when I get into all the individual swatches and comparisons, I filmed those that day as well, and I'm going to include that footage in this video. But I wanted to come back today and try another look with this palette, because I just didn't like how the look that I did that day looked on camera. I actually liked how it looked in person. The day that I did that look, I actually wore that makeup the whole day, and I loved how it looked in person, but I just wasn't liking how it came across on camera. I think part of it was just my styling. I didn't like the way my hair went with the look. I didn't like the top I was wearing with it. It was all too much warmth, I think. I felt like it just wasn't the best showcasing of the palette, so I wanted to kind of try it again, try a different type of makeup look and styling. I think I'm happier with the way this one turned out. I never really know till I look back at the footage how everything's kind of coming across. And when it came to the actual colors in this palette, in that previous look, I think the main culprit was actually this shade here, which is actually a gorgeous shade. I love it. And you'll see when I swatch it out on my hand how beautiful it is, the shade Cherubim. But I had put that all under my entire lower lash line quite boldly, and it just wasn't a good color for that location. In combination with all the warmth I also had on the lid, it was just making me look a little bit sickly, and I felt like I looked a little bit tired. Now, as I said, I think the hair and the outfit was part of the problem too. I don't think I would do that again and put this very warm shade so boldly under my lower lash line, at least unless I had like a contrasting cool color on the lid, so not using the shades from this palette. So I do find it to be quite warm. There is some more coolness in these two shimmers here, but the mattes are all quite warm, and even the luster shade Taffeta Fan actually does translate quite warm. It's what's on my inner corner now. So you'll be able to see all the shadows up close, and as I said, I'll be doing the individual swatches, so hopefully you'll get a better sense of the colors that way. But those were just the issues that I faced the first time using it. And the thing that I feel like is missing from this, for me, is a deep, cooler brown. This is the deepest shade here, and it looks a little deeper, I find, in the pan than it actually translates, and it's quite warm. It's the kind of shade that it probably wouldn't feel too warm if there were other cooler or more neutral tones that I could work with in here. But because all of these mattes and this luster come across as so warm, there's just not enough contrasting for me on my eye. So today I actually did cheat a little bit, and I went into the Cinnabar palette, which is also a warm toned palette, but it's more of a yellow ochre undertoned warm rather than the kind of more peachy, rosy, pinky undertones in the MUSE palette. And I find that because the undertones are a little bit different, although this is warm, this was enough to kind of ground the look a little bit for me. So I went into the Fired Earth shade right there just to kind of deepen a little bit. I went very lightly with it because I didn't want it to take over or obscure the overall impression of this palette. I wanted to show a look that is pretty true to this palette, but I just felt like I needed that little bit of extra depth and not quite as rosy undertoned matte in the look. I had also made a little bit of an error when I was lining my eyes in the previous look, and you'll see that. I went in first with the Victoria Beckham Fig eyeliner, which is a purple, and I didn't mean to do that at all, so I ended up just going over top of it with Cocoa, which was the shade that I had intended to use, which is a nice deep kind of neutral brown. So I did use Cocoa today just by itself as the liner, and I felt that that also helped to just kind of ground the eye and give it the structure that I felt it needed using these quite warm rosy colors all over the eye. So those are my slight criticisms of this palette, or at least what I would like to change is really just to have one deeper, not so rosy brown matte. But I do think this is a beautiful color story, and the quality of all of these shadows is really gorgeous. This is another one just like the Myth palette, where all of the mattes in here are actually velvet, so we don't have any of the seamless mattes. And these velvets are just such a joy to work with. They're just so soft and smooth and creamy, and they give such an even, beautiful coverage and blend out so beautifully on the lid. They're really a joy to work with. So I love that aspect of this palette, and I love all of the individual colors here, even though I wish there were another shade in here. Each of these shades is truly gorgeous. And this is the last deep dive palette video that I'm filming. I think I might post this one before Sorcery, but since it's the last one that I'm filming and I've now had a chance to work pretty in depth with all of these palettes, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the collection as a whole, the quality of the eyeshadows, and so on. So overall, in terms of the color stories, I think it's really wonderful that each of these palettes is such a distinct color story. It can be hard to tell online in pictures sometimes what the differences might be. I think each one of these color stories really holds its own next to each of the other ones, and each is very succinct, and I love that they're so compact with just 6 shades. It's really nice to not have to think too hard about which shades you want to use, what types of looks you want to do, but there's still so much variety that you can do with just one of these palettes. And I think it kind of depends on the palette. The Muse, I would say, is probably one of the least versatile, at least in the ways that I've been able to come up with to use it so far. And so I think some of the other ones offer me at least some more options for variety of looks, but I still think each palette is really beautiful. And getting into the quality of the shadows, I've been talking over the course of this series about each of these formulas, but I'll just kind of go back and reiterate and sum up my thoughts on each of the formulas. So the seamless mattes, I do like them, but I prefer the velvets. There's nothing wrong with the seamless mattes, and if I didn't have the velvets to compare them to, I probably wouldn't have any criticisms of them at all. But I just feel like since we have the velvets, which are such a good formula, I'm not sure that I see the need for the seamless matte formula. I think the distinction mainly is that the seamless mattes are meant for blending and doing more diffusing, while the velvets can be used as an all-over base. But I feel like the velvets are also really good at blending and diffusing, while the seamless mattes are not as good as an all-over base. Now that I've used every single one of these shadows, looking back at my experience with the Vega palette where I had the Lamp Black, which was the seamless matte all over my lid, I can see that I think that color in a velvet formula would have worked more easily as an all-over color. Now I understand perhaps that's just not the purpose of that color to be used as an all-over base, but it's just something that I've noticed, that I feel like the velvet formula is more versatile. To me, it could do everything that the seamless matte formula can do, but the seamless matte formula can't do everything that the velvet formula can do. Those are my thoughts on those two formulas right now anyway. Into the satin metallics, I think it's good that she renamed most of the metallic shades to satin metallics because they're just a little bit more subtle than you might think of when you think of a metallic shadow. They're just not as reflective, but they are beautifully dense, really easy to work with. I think there's something to be said for that type of a metallic that's not as shiny, because in a sense it is a little bit more versatile in that you can almost treat it as a matte. And you'll see in my Sorcery video, I did 2 looks in that video as well, and one of them was a more blue leaning look. And I used the blue in that palette kind of as I would use a matte normally, and it worked really well. And because it didn't have too much reflection, it was able to hold its own and provide the kind of depth and shadow that I needed it to where I was placing it for that look. In terms of the luminous formula, we have 3 shades in that formula. One of them is Love and Venice, which I have on my eyes today. I'm just going to swatch all of these so we can look at them since there are only 3. We have Mercurial in the Sorcery palette, which is actually a luminous duochrome, so it's even a little bit different from the other luminous shades. And then in the Vega palette, we have Supernova. another luminous. So Supernova and Love and Venice, which are not duochromes, feel much more creamy to the touch than Mercurial and Sorcery. In Mercurial, you can almost feel the shimmery particles in there, and it just feels a little bit drier to the touch. So these are the three luminous shades: Love and Venice from the Muse palette, Mercurial from Sorcery, and Supernova from Vega. And I feel like Love and Venice just doesn't have as much shine. It's not as reflective as the other two here. And I definitely find Mercurial to be the most reflective, which I think makes sense because it is a little bit of a different formula. But even Supernova from Vega I find to be a little bit brighter and more of a pop than we get from Love and Venice. So for me, because I'm really attracted to that bright shine, I think that Love and Venice is the least impressive of the luminous shades in this collection, at least so far. It's just more subtle. And then we have the One Luster, which feels very similar in pan to the Satin Metallics. It has that very, very dense feeling, not super creamy feeling, but not dry feeling either. So that's Taffeta Fan, which is in the Muse palette. And as I said, it's the One Luster. And I'm just reviewing my notes from Lisa's reveal video. She said the lusters have the same payoff as metallics, but smaller pearls. So I think that really makes sense that it feels the same as the Satin Metallics because it has the same level of opacity and payoff, but just a little bit of a finer reflect on it. And then we had the two top coats, Ritual from Cinnabar and Illusionism from Myth. And I think these are great accents to have to these palettes. So because most of the metallics aren't super bright and shiny, it's really nice to have these transparent toppers. So they're not going to change the colors of any of the shadows underneath too much. It's really hard to see them there. But they're going to add that more bright kind of glistening shine that you're not necessarily going to get from the metallics. Now there are two, and I go through this in my Sorcery video as well, there are two of the originally named metallics that have not been switched to being called Satin Metallics, and they're both in the Sorcery palette. We have Grotto here and Madrigal here. So those are still called just metallics, and they do definitely have more shine and reflectivity than the Satin Metallics. And they do feel like a different formula. They feel a little bit creamier and not quite as dense in the pan. I've had a few questions about people saying that they've heard that others, or they've experienced themselves, that the shadows are not wearing as well as they would like them to, not lasting as long, and not having as much long-term impact on the eyes. And I will say in my first video where I was dipping into all of these different palettes, I did find that that look didn't wear all that well. I hadn't used any kind of primer. I don't think I had even put my Nars Soft Matte Concealer on my lid for that one. So I do think that without some sort of base to help out these shadows, they may not last all that long on your lids. Now that's something that I've actually been finding with all of my eyeshadows lately. So even formulas that I never had issues with before, I've just found that they're fading more. So perhaps it has something to do with age and my skin is just changing or something. So it's not a problem that I found to be unique to the Lisa Eldridge eyeshadow palettes. I've been experiencing that with all of my powder eyeshadows lately. But I have found ways to work with these that help a great deal and really give great payoff and excellent longevity to these shadows. So one of the things that I've been loving doing is actually using the Lisa Eldridge Liquid Lurex eyeshadows as a base. So I will just do a very thin layer all over my lid of whatever my chosen color that day is of the Liquid Lurex, and then basically just treat that as a primer and go right over top once it's dried down, which only takes about a minute. With any of these eyeshadow palettes. And I find that makes my looks last all day long with no issues. And it also gives this beautiful underlying texture to the whole look, which I think is really fun. Depending on the color you're using, I've been tending to go for kind of lighter colors that are in sync with the palette that I'm using. So I don't find it changes the overall color of the look too much, but it just enhances everything. It gives this beautiful kind of extra ethereal look because you do have those tiny little shimmers in the background of the look, but it still allows you to be able to build depth with the deeper colors and the mattes and so on. So I've been loving doing that. I've also tested out the Nars transparent eyeshadow base a couple times. I just had like a little sample packet of that. It's all gone now, but I tried it with a couple of the palettes and I found that worked incredibly well too. It really helped the shadows to go further. So I've mentioned in a couple of the previous videos that some of the mattes I find to be a little bit more softly pigmented, particularly in the Vega palette. But when they're used over that Nars transparent eyeshadow primer, the same amount of shadow I find really goes a lot further over that and lasts perfectly all day. Actually, the other look that I did with the Muse palette, which you'll see in this video, I used that primer and it wore perfectly all day. There was not a bit of fading and the color stayed really true and pigmented all day long. And then I've also found that the Nars Soft Matte Concealer works really nicely as a base as well. It's not quite as powerful as the actual eye primer or the liquid Lurex in terms of increasing the longevity, but it definitely does increase the longevity and also again allows you to use a little bit less of the product, keeps the colors true, but I do find the shadows fade a little bit faster just using that as opposed to the liquid Lurex or a dedicated eye primer. I mentioned in another video that I have ordered one of the Nars eyeshadow primers. I actually ordered one of the tinted ones, the lightest shade, but it hasn't arrived yet, so I can't speak yet to how that plays with these shadows. In the overall range, I would like to see some more light to mid-tone metallics, and I mentioned that I think in my Myth video as well. It's just something that I think would further enhance this range and make it a little bit more perfect for my personal preferences. A lot of the satin metallics in here are a little bit darker and just don't give the kind of highlighting and brightening effect with that opaque base that I like to have. So that's something that I would love to see as she continues to expand this range, is some more light to mid-toned, opaque based satin metallics and more true metallics as well. Now, many of these palettes, as you know, are based on or inspired by lipstick colors that she already has. And I would personally love to see a fawn palette based on the Velvet Fawn lipstick. I think that would just be my dream palette, to have something kind of like Cinnabar, but in a more neutral leaning cool color story, but not quite as cool and gray as Vega. So something with more kind of neutral leaning cool, like rosy, putty, brown, beigey shades. I think that would be just a dream come true for me. So fingers crossed that she comes up with a fawn color story, because I think that would be amazing. That's my number one hope for upcoming palettes from Lisa. Just a note on how these shadows actually look on the skin. Every time I look at myself in the mirror after I've used one of these palettes, and especially when I look really close up on my eyes, I'm really struck by how flattering these shadows look on the skin and how they really just become one and meld with the skin. It's almost as though they have no like thickness of their own. They just melt right into the skin and just are so seamless looking and look like they are really part of your skin, which is something that I'm not sure I can say I've experienced with any other eyeshadow formulas. So for me, that is one of the really exceptional things about these. And I think that's something that probably makes these formulas really great for all types of skin, for drier skin, for more textured skin, more mature skin. I just think that because they have this ability to meld with the skin and look so flattering on it, that they're going to be usable for a lot of different skin types and textures. So I think that's everything I have to say about these palettes for now. I want to now get back into looking more closely at the Muse palette. So I'm going to show you the two looks that I've done with this palette, and then I'll just come back and sign off. So our first shade today is Tea Room. This is a velvet. All of the mattes in this palette are velvets, and they feel incredibly soft and creamy to the touch. And Tea Room is described as a soft pink apricot. So this shade I kind of put all over my lid. I actually started out this look with one of the Victoria Beckham liners, the Bordeaux liner. You'll be able to see all of this in the demo after I do these swatches. But then I kind of covered over everything and blended out my shape using this shade, and it was a dream to work with. I've found that my favorite type of brush to use with the mattes, both the velvets and the seamless mattes in these palettes, is undyed goat hair brushes. So I've been finding my Refer brushes especially useful. Most of mine have shadow on them now, but this type of brush, so where it's the white undyed goat hair, I find those are the perfect texture to pick up these very soft mattes. The first palette that I thought of when I saw the reveal of this Muse palette was the Charlotte Tilbury Pillow Talk palette. So both the Pillow Talk Quad and the larger Instant Eye palette, that's Pillow Talk from Charlotte Tilbury. I, for the life of me, can't find my Pillow Talk Quad. I may have given it away, I'm not sure. But I do have my larger Charlotte Tilbury Pillow Talk, and I wanted to compare with this shade right here, which is in the Desk Trio in this large palette. There's what it looks like on my finger. And there it is. So it's much deeper than Tea Room. There's more depth and vibrance to the Charlotte Tilbury one, but that's the most similar shade that I think I have, that I could think of anyway, to compare to Tea Room. Next up is Tomorrow's Party, which is a satin metallic formula, and it's described as a burnished warm rose. I'm going to pull on this one from the Charlotte Tilbury palette to compare. Charlotte Tilbury looks a little bit more pink and a little bit cooler, and the Lisa Eldridge Tomorrow's Party is looking a little bit warmer and peachier. I also wanted to pull in two of the liquid Lurexes. So the shade Maya, I think, is the most likely to be a little bit more similar to Tomorrow's Party. So there's Maya in the liquid Lurex, and they do look quite similar. Maya has a shinier finish. All of the liquid Lurexes do have a shinier finish than these satin metallics, just more reflective, but there is some similarity there. Maya might be a little bit cooler and pinker though. I also pulled out Angelica, which I think is probably going to be more brown, but I thought it would be worth taking a look at that as well. Yeah, so Angelica is a lot kind of cooler, more toned down, brown, bronzy looking. And I also wanted to take a look at the Victoria Beckham Lid Luster in Tea Rose. There's that, another one that I think is going to be a lot kind of browner and bronzier. Yes, it certainly is. So that's Tea Rose there, and then there is Tomorrow's Party. Next up we have Vintage Mulberry, which is again a velvet, and it's described as a deep plum brown. So there's definitely a ruddiness to that. This is the deepest shade in the palette. This is what I use to add the most depth and shadow to this look today. I'll compare it to Deep Ochre and Cinnabar, which I already did in the Cinnabar video, but just in case you didn't see that or you wanted to see it again. They have similar depths, but Deep Ochre has a more yellow undertone, and we have a more kind of purpley berry type undertone in Vintage Mulberry. Let's also take a look at this shade in the Charlotte Tilbury palette. So that's the middle shade in the Date Trio. And those look quite similar actually. I think there is a little bit more brown and a little bit more depth to the one in the Charlotte Tilbury. And I can see on my hand, I don't know if it comes through all that well on camera, but there's a lot more orange in the undertone of the Charlotte Tilbury one. Next up we have Love in Venice, which is a luminous formula, and it's just described as a rose gold. So there it is. This one is one that looks much lighter when you actually have it on the skin than it does in the pan, because it has that semi-transparent base and it has more shine and reflect than the satin metallics. So you can see that really beautiful wet look shine. And this one I used over kind of from here all the way into the inner corner on my lid, just to kind of top everything off and add that shine and a little bit of kind of lighter dimension in those areas. I wanted to compare this one to the Charlotte Tilbury Jewel Pot in the shade Pillow Talk. They have a sort of similar formula, and that more sort of semi-transparent base and the nice bright Shine and Reflect. So there's the Pillow Talk Jewel Pot. It looks somewhat similar. I think they have similar base colors going on. It almost looks like the Charlotte Tilbury base is a little bit warmer, but then the reflect on the Charlotte Tilbury is perhaps a little bit cooler than the reflect on the Lisa Eldridge. And the only comparable shade in the Charlotte Tilbury is this one right here. And it's a different formula. This is more like the satin metallic formula. So I don't know how similar they'll look, but let's see. All right, so a lot more opacity with the one in the Pillow Talk palette and a lot more warmth. It looks quite orangey in comparison. Next up is Cherubim, another velvet, and this is described as a muted clay pink. Now this one was quite warm. You'll see me apply this to my lower lash line. It's the first shadow that I applied to my lower lash line in the demo, and it did look quite warm there. I also applied it on my lid, and I really liked how it looked there. It didn't look quite as starkly warm. I applied it over top of Tea Room, and it blended really beautifully with that color. So I think it is well described as a muted clay pink, because I can definitely see the pink there, but there's certainly a clay kind of terracotta feeling to it as well. I compare it to this shade in the Charlotte Tilbury palette. So I'm seeing a lot less pink in the Charlotte Tilbury. I find it to be a lot more in that kind of terracotta clay direction, where there's a little bit more balance with the pink in the Lisa Eldridge Cherubim. And lastly, we have Taffeta Fan, which is the Luster formula, Delicate Pearly Champagne. Beautiful reflect on this formula as well. The only shadow I really wanted to compare this one to is the Chiffon Lid Luster from Victoria Beckham. So I think Chiffon looks a little bit cooler. It's kind of a more neutral tone overall. The base of Chiffon is definitely cooler. It looks almost gray in comparison to the base of Taffeta Fan. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or comments below. I always love to see those. And if you'd like to see more from me and you haven't subscribed to my channel already, I'd love for you to do so. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in my next video.